Hello, and welcome to this pre-recorded feedback event for the June 2015 examination for Unit 1, Construction Technology. To help you get the most out of this feedback event, you may want to have the following documents handy, as we will refer to them during the session. This includes the question paper, which is used throughout this presentation. Here are the aims and objectives of today's session. You will receive feedback on national performance of candidates of the June 2015 examination series, consider questions where significant numbers of candidates underperformed and possible reasons why, discuss the lead examiner's report, consider delivery strategies and share good practice, address common issues, find out about further support available. Please open the unit specification for Unit 1, Construction Technology. The unit overview provides the basis for the general content that the exam will cover. The unit focuses on the different forms of construction that can be used for low-rise, up to 5.2 meters in height, offices, retail units, and homes. The unit includes coverage of the use of prefabrication to construct buildings as part of a sustainable method of construction, modern methods of construction which benefit the environment sustainably, pre-construction works, substructure works, superstructure works. The introduction mentions that learners will develop an ability to understand how walls, floors, and roofs are constructed, and you will be able to name each component part along with its functions. The format and purpose of the assessment is a 1-hour paper-based exam worth 50 marks. The examination consisted of a variety of question types, including multiple choice, objective questions, short answer questions, and an extended writing opportunity at the end of the examination paper. Where learners are expected to explain for 2 marks, they get 1 mark for the identification and 1 mark for an expansion. Centres need to make sure that learners are fully prepared to sit the external assessment, entered for assessments at appropriate times, with due regard for resit opportunities as necessary. Sample assessment, SAM, and the 2 previous examinations and marking schemes for this unit are available on the Pearson website to help centres prepare learners for assessment. This is a GCSE equivalent Level 2 qualification and should be treated as such. It is not advisable for learners in Year 9 to sit the exam, as they may not have enough knowledge or experience of the subject area. You can read the lead examiner's report, which has been published on the Pearson website. In addition, it is also worth reminding you that unless learners are taught the full 30 guided learning hours intended for the unit, then it is unlikely they will be sufficiently prepared to complete the exam. Question 1 was a straightforward multiple-choice question. Learners were required to identify 2 pre-construction site setup activities. This was well attempted by learners. The 2 correct responses were B. Installation of site accommodation, C. Gates and security of site. A number of learners incorrectly identified the permanent control of subsoil water as a pre-construction site setup activity, when this is in fact part of the substructure groundworks phase of a construction project. The learner response shown was awarded 2 marks for 2 correct responses. For question 2A, learners were required to identify two purposes of thermal insulation in a building. This was only satisfactorily attempted by learners, with many achieving 1 mark only. Most incorrect responses often included that the purpose of thermal insulation was to improve sound insulation, which is incorrect. The primary purpose or purposes of thermal insulation are clearly stated within the unit specification and included within the mark scheme, which centres should refer to. The learner response shown was worth 2 marks. The learner has correctly identified the need to keep heat in the building and the reduction of heating costs. Both are acceptable answers. For question 2B, learners were required to identify 2 locations where sound insulation may be installed in a building. This was well attempted by most learners. Many learners identified a wall, floor, ceiling, attic, loft, door, window, etc., which were all considered to be acceptable answers. Specific geographic locations, for example airports, London, or regular rooms within a domestic property, were not acceptable answers. This response shown was worth 2 marks for identifying suitable locations of a cavity wall or ceiling or roof. Question 2C was a straightforward multiple-choice question. Learners were required to identify 2 materials or components that are used to achieve weather resistance in a building. The majority of learners correctly identified the 2 correct materials. D. Flashings. E. Double glazing. The question was well understood by many learners, with most scoring a minimum 1 mark. The response shown was worth 2 marks for the 2 correctly identified answers. Question 2D. Learners were required to give 2 design features that will reduce the spread of fire in a building. This was mostly well answered by learners, with many achieving a minimum of 1 mark. Acceptable responses are included in the mark scheme. In addition, learners were awarded marks for shortened versions of their responses, for example, compartments, barriers, etc. In the learner responses shown, Learner A was awarded 1 mark for the stated design feature of a sprinkler system. No mark is awarded for the first response, as the fire alarms themselves do not reduce the spread of fire. Learner B was awarded 2 marks for 2 correct responses. Question 2E was a straightforward multiple-choice question. Learners were required to identify 2 types of load that buildings are designed to resist. This was mostly well answered by students, with many achieving 2 marks, and most achieving at least 1 mark. The correct responses were A. Snow, D. Self-weight. Some students failed to identify that the self-weight of a building is a type of load buildings are designed to resist. The learner response shown was awarded 2 marks for the 2 correct load types. Question 3A required learners to name the 3 types of foundation. In general, this question was poorly answered by many learners. The correct acceptable answers for each foundation detail were 1. Raft, 2. Pile, 3. Strip. Many students did not give a response, or included inaccurate terms, such as trench or mass fill. assumed to be taken from question 3b. Concrete or pillar foundation. The identification of the 3 basic foundation types is an important part of this unit, yet students had limited understanding of which foundation type was detailed. The included response was worth 3 marks for 3 correct responses stated. Question 3b required learners to explain one advantage and one disadvantage of a trench or mass-fill concrete foundation. The command verb used for this question is explain. Therefore, 1 mark was allocated to the identification of an advantage or disadvantage, and 1 mark for a linked explanation. Learners were often able to achieve 1 mark for the identification of an advantage or disadvantage, but were then unable to develop a linked explanation from it. Many learners achieved 1 mark by identifying that an advantage of a trench or mass-fill concrete foundation is: it is a quicker form of construction, it is easy to construct, it reduces the need for skilled labour. Some students did not interpret the question well and gave a range of inaccurate responses, which did not relate to the advantages or disadvantages of a trench or mass-fill concrete foundation. Incorrect responses included: it is a greater load-bearing foundation, it has greater stability, it is more durable, it is cheap, it is not always the cheaper option. In the 2 clips, response 1 was awarded 2 marks. The first response has identified that trench or mass-fill concrete foundations are quick and easy to install, 1 mark. But without a linked explanation, this response is not awarded the 2nd mark. The second response has identified that trench or mass-fill concrete foundations are not suitable for all ground types, 1 mark. But without a linked explanation, this response is not awarded the 2nd mark. Response 2 was awarded 2 marks. The first response has identified that trench or mass-fill concrete foundations are easy to construct, 1 mark, with the linked explanation of reduced construction time, 1 mark, that is, cost-effective. However, the second response is a disadvantage of many types of foundation and is not specific to trench or mass-fill foundations. Question 4 required learners to label 5 components of a window head detail. In general, this question was poorly answered by many learners. The correct acceptable answers for each component were: 1. Part 1. Weep hole, or cavity vent, or cavity drain. Part 2. Window or glass. Part 3. Wall tie. Part 4. Cavity tray or cavity gutter or DPC. Part 5. Lintel. Many students did not provide responses or included inaccurate terms such as wall plate, insulation or brickwork. The response included scored 4 marks for 4 components correctly labelled. Question 5 required learners to sketch a cross-section through an external wall of a timber-framed building. This question requires learners to be able to demonstrate the use of sketching techniques, as per the requirements of Topic C1 Superstructure Walls section. This was poorly attempted by many students. Many either did not attempt a response or focused incorrectly on a traditional cavity masonry wall. Some learners also sketched details of a solid ground floor or flat roof construction form, which had been included in previous exam series, rather than the specific cross-section requirements of an external wall of a timber-framed building, as indicated in the question. Some learners also included details with components in an incorrect order. Centres should consult with the mark scheme to consider the detail required for a sketch question of this type. In the two clips, Response 1 was awarded 5 marks. These were awarded for 5 correctly labelled components. Although the hatching for insulation is only a close approximation to the correct fill pattern, it is sufficient and is correctly placed and labelled. 1 mark is awarded for each timber frame component. The 4th mark is awarded for the cladding. Response 2 was awarded 4 marks. This was for a correct sketch detail with 4 components correctly labelled. Note, although this isn't a standard timber frame detail, it is nevertheless a suitable detail that does exist within sustainable construction. Question 6a required learners to state one function of a roof. This was well answered by most students. The most common correct answers included shelter, protection from the weather, allows rainwater to be directed off the building. The mark scheme identifies a wide range of acceptable responses. Additional learner responses were accepted, including keeps the weather out, insulation, stops the rain from coming in, allows rainwater to run off the building. The shown response was worth 1 mark, as the function of a roof is to provide shelter. Question 6b was a straightforward multiple-choice question. Learners were required to identify 2 components used in the construction of roofs. This was only satisfactorily attempted by learners, with many achieving 1 mark only. The correct responses were B. Wall plate, E. Jack rafter. Most learners identified either a wall plate or jack rafter as a correct component, but often learners identified a cavity tray or aluminium walling as an answer, which are both incorrect. The components of a roof are clearly stated within the unit specification and included within the marking scheme, which centres should refer to. The response shown was worth 2 marks for the 2 correct responses stated. Question 7 required learners to explain 2 advantages of using a solid ground floor instead of a suspended timber ground floor in a house. Learners were often able to achieve 1 mark for the identification of an advantage, but were then unable to develop a linked explanation. The mark scheme for this question is detailed and offers centres the opportunity to review how linked responses should be presented. In the 2 clips shown, Response 1, 2 marks were awarded for correctly identifying that a solid ground floor can take heavier loads, 1 mark, and it will last longer, 1 mark. As this learner has not provided linked responses, the additional 2 marks cannot be awarded. Response 2. 1 mark was awarded for correctly identifying that timber can rot. No marks are awarded to it is easier to make, as this is not necessarily so. Question 8 required learners to explain 1 way in which on-site construction wastage can be reduced. The command verb used for this question is explain. Therefore, 1 mark was awarded to the identification of a way of on-site construction wastage, and 1 mark for a linked explanation. Learners were often able to achieve 1 mark for the identification of a way to reduce on-site construction wastage, but then were unable to provide a linked explanation. Identification marks were awarded for order the right amount of material, order as it is needed. In the 2 clips shown, Response 1. 1 mark was awarded for correctly identifying the need to cut or order material to the right dimensions. There is no linked response, so 1 mark was awarded for identification only. Response 2. 2 marks were awarded, as the learner has provided a correct linked response. Benefit of doubt has been applied, as the learner has implied correct lengths and sizes when stating the correct amount. Question 9 required learners to explain 2 reasons why internal partitions are often constructed using softwood. The command verb used for this question is explain. Therefore, 1 mark was awarded to the identification of a reason why softwood is used in the construction of internal partitions, and 1 mark for a linked explanation. Identification marks were awarded for cheaper than hardwood, speed of erection, quick to assemble and construct, lighter than other types of wood. Identification marks were not awarded for cheaper to install or quicker to assemble, without a comparator. Marks for linked responses were achieved in some instances. Typical examples included lightweight, 1 mark, reduces the load on the structure, 1 mark. Softwood is light, 1 mark, so is easy to move, 1 mark. The mark scheme for this question is detailed and offers centres the opportunity to review how linked responses should be presented. In the 2 clips shown, Response 1. 2 marks were awarded. The first response indicates that softwood partitions may be easily modified. The second response is accepted as being quicker to install. Both responses lack a linked explanation, and therefore 2 identification marks were awarded only. Response 2. 2 marks were awarded. Both responses lack a linked explanation, and therefore 2 identification marks are awarded. The learner has indicated that softwood is lighter than other types of wood, and indicated that softwood is from a renewable source. Question 10 required learners to discuss the benefits of 2 structural forms which could be used to create accommodation for university students. The command verb used for this question is discuss. A discussion question requires learners to investigate a theme or topic by reasoning or argument. Learners should identify the issue or situation that is being assessed within the question, and explore all aspects of the issue or situation by reasoning or argument. This question is marked using the level descriptors at the end of the mark scheme. Marks were awarded dependent on the detail of points identified and described, and as to whether the learner had made a comparison between the benefits of the 2 options and linked their responses to the creation of residential accommodation for university students. Most learners attempted this question. Many achieved some marks. Learner marks were mostly in Mark Band 1, or at the lower end of Mark Band 2. Some high Mark Band 2 scoring learner work was also seen. Learners generally identified a few key points from one or both structural forms. Few learners provided a balanced argument with sufficient detail to achieve marks beyond those in Mark Band 2. In the two clips, Response 1, 2 marks were awarded. This response falls in the middle of Mark Band 1, as the learner has identified some key features with limited link descriptions. Both forms of construction are discussed. However, the response is superficial and generic, and in places is incorrect. Response 2. 6 marks were awarded. This response falls at the top of Mark Band 2, as while the learner shows developed knowledge of the subject matter, for example, the use of cross-wall construction for flats, the response is not linked to the scenario given in the question stem. In order to move into Mark Band 3, the response needs to be linked more closely to the scenario, and there is the potential to further develop the commentary in relation to traditional brick cavity wall. Why learners did well. Summary. Learners tended to perform well in the earlier multiple choice and short answer Level 1 pass questions, as these tended to be easier and learners could use common sense. Learners, particularly those who achieved an overall Level 2 pass grade, did well on questions 1, 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D, 2E, 6A, 6B, and were often able to achieve good marks on questions 3A, 4 and 5. Level 2 pass grade learners were then often able to achieve marks for the identification components of the more challenging questions 3A, 7, 8, 9 and 10. Most areas could be improved by entering the learner at a stage that is right for them, and after they have been taught the necessary subject knowledge. Activity 1. You may want to pause at this point to carry out the activity. Look at the example of a learner response to question 8. Using the mark scheme, decide what mark you think should be awarded and why. At this point, you may pause the video to carry out the activity if you wish. Activity 1, marks awarded. The learner response was awarded 2 marks, as the learner has mentioned the use of prefabricated components and provided a linked response stating they are made to measure, and as a result there is a reduction in construction wastage on site. Activity 2. Look at the example on the next slide of a learner response to question 9. Using the mark scheme, decide what mark you think should be awarded and why. At this point, you may pause the video to carry out the activity if you wish. Question 9, learner response. Activity 2, marks awarded. This response was awarded 2 marks. 2 identification marks have been awarded for stating a softwood partition wall is lighter and would provide reduced weight on the foundations. A further identification mark is awarded by the learner stating softwood is sustainable. centers should note that simply stating softwood is lighter was insufficient for an identification mark, unless there was a comparison made with an alternative material, for example, blockwork, etc. Activity 3. Look at the example of a learner response to question 10. Using the mark scheme, decide what mark you think should be awarded and why. At this point, you may pause the video to carry out the activity if you wish. Response 1. On this learner response, we have highlighted where indicative content has been covered. Using the mark scheme, explain why the marks have and have not been awarded for this response. When you are ready, please continue with the presentation to view the answers. Please now mark response 2. Activity 3. Marks awarded. Question 10 is levels-based, and centers should look at the mark scheme to see how marks are awarded. This response was worth 4 marks and falls within mark band 2. There are some appropriate linked responses, but if you consider the previous 6-mark example and the marking scheme, you can see that some responses are a little superficial. 4 marks is a fair mark to award. This slide summarizes some common issues with the paper and makes suggestions for improvement. Center cohort responses indicated that where learners had been appropriately prepared for the exam, that most learners achieved either a Level 1 or Level 2 pass. Many learners were able to provide the identification of explanations or benefits, but were unable to provide a linked response in order to access higher criteria marks. Not enough use was made by learners of the given scenario in the question stem. Generic answers were offered and were not specific enough to the question or scenario. In some cases, there was a clear lack of understanding of technical terminology, which could imply that either learners had been entered on an inappropriate program to their academic level, or that centers had not prepared learners suitably for the new Level 1 and 2 format of the exam. Many learners were not fully prepared for this assessment and lacked the relevant experience. Considering delivery strategies and best practice. This slide really is asking you to pause and reflect on the delivery of the qualification and best practices for the future, based on the presentation to date. For further support and feedback relating to this external assessment, please visit our dedicated BTEC results web pages via the link shown here. There are a range of further training events available, which will also be useful in providing support and guidance with the delivery of this qualification as a whole, and these can be accessed via the link shown here. And finally, to access lots of useful support and resources for construction, make sure you visit the subject page by clicking on this image. Just email teachingconstruction@pearson.com to join the mailing list. We hope you have found this session useful. Please take the time to complete our short online survey regarding this recording, as we very much value your feedback. Thank you for your time.